Good morning, everyone. Let's get straight into our text from this morning. Today, we are looking at Mark chapter 7 in our sermon, and then Mark chapter 8 in our Bible class. Our key characters today. 4 key characters: Jesus, the Pharisees, the Gentile woman, and the deaf man. If you're making notes, you might want to write those down. Today, we're looking at what happens when you take traditions too far. Today, we're looking at what happens when traditions overtake the more important things that those traditions were there to uphold. Everybody loves traditions. You think about your family growing up. You think about what traditions you had. Maybe you had a tradition about what you did on your birthdays, or what you did on leading up to Christmas, or on some special holidays. Maybe you had a tradition of what you did when you went on holiday, and maybe you all go riding in a boat together, you all go jet skiing, you all go for a picnic. Traditions are good things. They're good, healthy things. But traditions, when they become laws, become unhelpful and actually can, in a spiritual sense, jeopardize our souls. So today we're looking at a verse, one verse in Mark chapter 7 that the Bible scholar William Barclay, one of the great Bible scholars of the past few centuries, he called it the most revolutionary verse in the entire New Testament. I wonder if you noticed it as we were reading through. The most revolutionary verse in the New Testament was this one, Mark 7 and verse 23. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Jesus goes from talking about traditions and washing hands to making one of the most profound statements that he ever makes, and what separates Christianity from any other movement in history, this statement here. Okay, so we're going to look at, we're going to spend most of the time this morning looking at this first story that we have about traditions and the washing of hands. The people of Jesus' time loved their traditions. They didn't want to break the law of Moses, and so they came up with traditions that they kept to make sure that they didn't come close to breaking the law of Moses. There was a saying in the time of Jesus where they said, traditions are the fence that we put around the law of Moses. You know, you put a fence around something to keep it in and to keep it safe. They had the same thing. They wanted to keep the law safe, and so they had these traditions that fenced in the law, made sure that people followed the law and that there was no chance that it could be broken. And these traditions went to all sorts of areas. For example, we looked at these a few weeks ago with the Sabbath. They had some very strong rules on what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to spit on the Sabbath. Why weren't you allowed to spit? Because you would be cultivating the ground. You might spit on one of your plants, and that might provide it nutrients. And then you would be farming on the Sabbath. So no spitting. You weren't allowed to look in the mirror on the Sabbath. Why not in the mirror? Because if you saw a grey hair, you might be tempted to pluck it out, and that would be working, and you can't work on the Sabbath. And so all of these traditions, all of these fences were up to make sure that the law is upheld, because the law is important. The biggest concern and the most traditions that the Jews had in the time of Jesus were around cleanness. We have that saying, cleanliness is next to godliness. That was true for the Jews. They really took cleanliness seriously. In the Mishnah, which is a book that contains a lot of these traditions and Jewish writings of the time of Jesus, the largest section, the biggest chapter, is on cleanness. In the law, there's not a whole lot to say about cleanness. It tells you that if you're a priest, you have to wash your hands, mainly because you've been slaughtering bulls and things and you've got blood all over your hands. You have to wash them. And if you're a high priest, on the Day of Atonement, you have to take a bath before you get up and put on your white robes and go to the Holy of Holies. So it's quite funny that even though these were not very significant laws, and they only applied to the priests and the high priests, the Pharisees came up with 35 pages of traditions, of fences, on how to be clean, and they applied it to all of the people. And it involved, look in verse 3 and 4 with me, it says, For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, doesn't that sound like a parent? Wash your hands properly. Did you wash them properly? Holding to the tradition of the elders. And verse 4, and when they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. So they've taken the law, which says that the priests have to wash their hands and the high priest has to take a bath, and they've got pages and pages and pages of fences around how to be clean by cleaning your cups and your bowls and your couches and so on. So what does Jesus have to say to them? Does he say those are good things? No, he says, you hypocrites, you play actors, you bunch of phonies, you two-faced imposters. How dare you accuse me of breaking tradition when you're breaking the law? Well, what does he mean? Why are they breaking the law? He's not talking about this specifically, but he gives an example, the next few verses, in verses 9 through 13, of a way that they elevate their tradition as so important that it ends up with them breaking God's law. In verses 9 through 13, read with me. It says, and he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father and mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do. One of the most important laws in the Old Testament was to honor your father and mother. It was in the Ten Commandments. It was repeated again and again. The penalty for not honoring your mother and father was death. And in that culture, when your parents get older and they need to be provided for, they need food, they need shelter, they need care, there wasn't a government to look after them, to give them social benefits. There wasn't a pension. The children needed to honor their parents by taking care of them. We have this backwards in our culture. We think that when our parents get older, they have to give more to us. The Bible says it's the other way around. When your parents get older, you have to give more to them. It is a shame, it is an embarrassment that our culture has so many nursing homes with so many unvisited parents. God's way is to honor your parents, especially as they get older. But the Pharisees came up with a tradition, and they said, if you had money lying around, if you had some possessions, what you could do is you could use the phrase, I dedicate that to God. In Hebrew, it's Corban. We call it Corban. And what it means is you've now vowed that that money can't be spent on anything else. It has to go to God. And that would be a good thing. You know, you're giving your money to God. Isn't that great? But what the children would do is they would see their parents who need help, need assistance. They have plenty of money that they're able to share, but they would say, oh, it's Corban. It's devoted to God. I can't give it to you. You'll have to find help somewhere else. Do you see that the tradition that they had created didn't fence in God's law? It actually caused the people to break God's law. Jesus says you're so focused on upholding this Corban stuff that you're actually telling people to break one of the 10 Commandments, one of the most serious laws that God gave. And he says this isn't the only thing you do. He finishes it by saying, and many such things you do. I like how he phrases it there. You have a fine way of rejecting God, of rejecting the commandment of God. You know, some people might have a bad way of rejecting the commandment of God. You've got a fine way of doing it. You've got a clever way of doing it, don't you? And he says the tradition actually causes people to break the law. But then he comes back to the subject of cleanness and washing hands. And he wants to address this point because the Pharisees not only are putting up their traditions as being important when they're not, but the Pharisees have missed the point entirely on what cleanness is all about. And he says in verse 14, and he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand." This is, again, like speaking to a toddler. I want you to listen to me, and I want you to understand what I'm saying as well. And here he gives his summary in verse 15. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. Now, Jesus isn't talking about microbiology here. He's not giving a study of disease. He's talking about our spiritual condition. And the disciples seem to find this hard to understand, because they ask in the next verse, they say in verse 17, when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. What parable? There was no parable there. Jesus just told them the truth. There's nothing outside that defiles you. It's what's inside that defiles you. And they say, can you tell us what the parable means? As if this is such a hard statement to understand. It must be a parable. It must mean something else. And Jesus just tells them what it means. He explains in verses 18 through to verse 20. He says, and he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean." And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. He's not talking about the food that's coming out of you. He's talking about the words and the actions and the thoughts that come out. In verse 21, he says, verse 21 and 22, "For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness." He breaks down 12 things here. 12 things that come out of the heart. 6 of them are verbs, 6 of them are nouns. That is, 6 of them are actions, things that you do. The other 6 are characteristics, your disposition, your character itself. So the 6 verbs that he gives, things that you can do that come from within you, sexual immorality, that is, anything that is outside of sexual activity outside of marriage. Theft, that's pretty straightforward. Murder, straightforward. Adultery, straightforward. Coveting, that is wanting more, wanting what other people have. Wickedness, this is doing, this is a broad term, but it refers mostly to exploiting people, not caring who gets hurt. So doing business deals or doing something that would result in others getting hurt so that you get a benefit. So these are things that you do, and then the nouns are things that you are, characteristics of a person. So a person who is deceitful, who has deceit in them, someone who doesn't care about the truth and doesn't mind bending the truth if it suits their circumstances. Sensuality, that is a lustful lack of self-control. I want this, so I'll do that. I feel this, so I'll go and fulfill that desire. Envy, this is jealousy. Slander, this is literally the habit of speaking critically and harshly about others. Someone who always is talking bad about other people, always is finding faults and looking for criticisms of others. Pride, a sense of superiority to others, thinking that you're cleverer, thinking that you're better. And foolishness or unreasonableness. 6 actions, 6 characteristics. This, Jesus says, this is the essence, 12 traits that come from within. Jesus knows exactly what's in our hearts. Why? Because he made our hearts. And he knows how they've been defiled by sin. Why is this revolutionary? Because then he finishes in verse 23 with that revolutionary verse, all these evil things come from within and they defile a person. What's so revolutionary about that? I'll tell you. 84% of people in our culture say that enjoying yourself is the highest goal of life. 84%. That's getting close to 9 in 10 people, 84% of people say that enjoying yourself is the highest goal of life. Okay, so if enjoying yourself is the highest goal of life, then how do you enjoy yourself? Well, 86% of people say that the way to enjoy yourself is to pursue the things you desire most. So, what's the goal in life? It's to enjoy yourself. How do you enjoy yourself? It's to pursue your desires. And how do you know what your desires are? 91% of people say to find yourself, look within. To find your desires, look in your heart. Okay, putting all of that together, around about 9 in 10 people believe these things, that you have to look into your heart to find your desires, that finding your desires and pursuing your desires is how you find enjoyment, and that enjoying yourself is the most important goal in your life. This is the golden rule of our culture. Follow your heart. Find out what your heart desires. Go and get it. Be yourself. The technical term for this is expressive individualism. You're an individual and you need to express yourself. You need to express whatever your heart says. And we have this message that our culture tells us again and again and again. You know Dylan Alcott, 2022 Australian of the Year, the tennis player? He said, "Be yourself and watch the world change." Steve Jobs said, "Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary." Anna Quindlen, she's a Pulitzer Prize winner, a writer for the New York Times. She said in a commencement speech, "Each of you is as different as your fingertips. Why should you march to any lockstep? Our love of lockstep is our greatest curse, the source of all that bedevils us. It is the source of homophobia, xenophobia, racism, sexism, terrorism, bigotry of every variety and hue, because it tells us that there is one right way to do things, to look, to behave, to feel, when the only right way is to feel your heart hammering inside you and to listen to what its timpani is saying. The only right way is to listen to what your heart says. Or if you don't read the New York Times, perhaps you watch Disney movies and you'll be more familiar with Elsa singing Let It Go, the song that has been listened to 3.2 billion times on YouTube. A song about finding your true identity and following your desires. And she sings, "It's time to see what I can do." You notice I have to use the words here. I don't know it off by heart. It's time to see what I can do to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free. I don't know about you, but I'm quite alarmed that the main song that our kids have been singing for the past decade says that there's no such thing as right and wrong, and no such thing as rules. Taylor Swift, the high priest of our time, she says in a speech that she gave, "We are so many things all the time, and it can be overwhelming figuring out who to be. I have some good news. It's totally up to you." It's totally up to you. Look inside your heart. Find who you are. Become who you want to be. It's what our culture says again and again. The world says the desires of my heart are what make me happy. And Jesus says the desires of your heart are what make you sick and defiled. And our culture blasts this message to us again and again through celebrities, through movies, through TV, through songs, through influencers on social media, that the purpose of your life is just follow your heart. And it promises happiness and it delivers confusion and disappointment. It's no wonder that the LGBTQ movement and the transgender movement have been so suddenly accepted. It's because all of these movements are based on that same premise. Look inside, find your desires, follow them. Don't listen to anyone who tells you otherwise. They get the same thing wrong that the Pharisees got wrong. They think that the problem is outside and can be washed off. And it's what's inside that is good and pure. And Jesus says, you can't wash off the stains of your heart. The problem with the world is not out there, it's in here. In the 1900s, the newspaper, The Times of London, they asked several notable authors of the day, what's wrong with the world? And G.K. Chesterton, one of the prominent authors of the day and writers, he wrote back and his letter said, "Dear sirs, I am." The world says the desires of your heart lead to happiness. Jesus says the desires of your heart lead to defilement. The world says follow your heart. Jesus says follow me. The world says love yourself. Jesus says love the Lord your God. The world says find yourself. Jesus says deny yourself. The world says believe in yourself. Jesus says believe in me. It is a hard message, but it is far, far more beautiful. Yes, you are more unclean and more defiled than you ever thought you were, but you're also more loved than you ever dared hope. Because Christ can make you clean. Not through the desires of your heart, but in spite of the desires of your heart. And that's what we see in the last two stories. We see these stories of the Gentile woman's faith and the deaf man and his faith. We won't go into detail of these, but they both display this need for Jesus that these people had. They weren't trying to make it on their own. They weren't saying, I'm fine, I can make it by myself. The Syrophoenician woman says, I need your help. And when Jesus pushes her away, she says, no, I need you. I need you to help heal my daughter. The deaf man, his friends bring him, and it says they beg Jesus to help, to heal. The world says you don't need Jesus. You can find happiness all by yourself. Just follow that heart of yours. And it's a lie. Don't be like the world. Be like the Syrophoenician woman. Be like the deaf man who came to Jesus and begged because they knew that their lives needed him. Our main point today, the world says, follow your heart. Jesus says, follow me. What are we going to do about our defiled hearts? What are we going to do about a heart that is ruined with our desires and our sinful thoughts and actions and behaviours? Jeremiah 2 and verse 22 says, although you wash yourself with soap and you use an abundance of cleansing powder, the stain of your guilt is still before me, declares the Lord. You can't wash it off with water and soap. So how do we cleanse our heart? You remember at the start of the lesson, I mentioned that in the law, the priests had to wash their hands and the high priest, he had to take a bath on the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, he would wake up, the high priest, he would take a bath, and then instead of putting on his normal high priestly garments, he would put on a different set of clothes for that one day. And these clothes were pure white. They would symbolize the purity that we need to approach God, to come before his presence. And clothed in that pure white, he can come before God. The Bible says that one day you and I are going to get a new set of robes. God is going to shout us with some new sparkling white robes so that we can meet him. Turn with me to Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7. We'll finish with these verses. Happiness doesn't come through following our hearts. Happiness doesn't come through becoming who I want to be. Real lasting happiness and peace comes through surrendering to Jesus having him wash away my sins so that one day I can be cleansed of my impure heart and clothed in white before God. It says in verse 13 and 14, then one of the elders addressed me, saying, who are these clothed in white robes, and from where have they come? I said to him, sir, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb.